Well, today's conversation was with Dr. James McGrath out of Butler University in Indianapolis. Dr. McGrath is the chair at Butler in New Testament languages and literature, and it was such a treat to get to chat with him today, for him to take time out of his academic schedule to have a conversation. I mean, apart from being just a brilliant biblical scholar, New Testament scholar, he has such a fascinating approach to New Testament subjects. I think the books that come out of Dr. McGrath are a testament to that. I mean, they're so unique while still being such gifts to the church. Books like Religion and Doctor Who, Theology and Science Fiction, and what our conversation is mainly focused on today, 2 books in the last year and a half, the A to Z of the New Testament, things that experts know that everyone else should too, as well as Christmaker, a life of John the Baptist, kind of a biography of John the Baptist. So I hope you learned something today through our conversation about the New Testament and about John the Baptist. And maybe a new spark would be lit by something Dr. McGrath shares, and you'll be excited to pick up one of those books as a wonderful aid and companion as you dig deeper into God's Word. So without further ado, here's that conversation. My name is Ryley, and you are listening to the Ryley Heppner Podcast. Dr. McGrath, I mean, you write interesting books. Not that there aren't a lot of books coming out in biblical scholarship that aren't interesting, but you seem to continue to put out books that I think are especially unique. And I haven't got to these yet. I came upon them after reading A to Z and Christmaker, but I'm excited to Religion and Doctor Who, Theology and Science Fiction, the Bible and Music. I mean, you just seem to write unique books or unique approaches to maybe familiar things. I think A to Z maybe is like that. Like, it seems like a very unique approach to trying to teach something that's been taught. I mean, as you kind of say in the book, essentially a New Testament introduction, but you took a brand new way of presenting it, which is, I don't know, you can say old things, but say them in new ways, and all of a sudden they're brand new. So it was an exciting.
Yeah, well, I continue to find that, right? And sometimes, someone will say something and suddenly it clicks, and you have that aha moment, and suddenly this thing that, is a huge insight. Also, you're like, wow, that seems so obvious. How did I not see that all along?
Yeah.
So I continue to have that experience myself. And I assume that, if I can help others have that kind of thing too, with my field of study, then
that's
good.
Awesome. Well, I want to ask you some questions about A to Z and then Christmaker too, if we have time. But can I start with just asking, how did you even end up in biblical scholarship?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, what did that journey look like for you? Did you know always that this is where I'm going to end up?
Absolutely not. No.
Okay.
And I don't know that there are many people, certainly not many people that I've met in my field, who, like, in the playground, where people are like, I want to be a doctor or a fireman or whatever, garbage collector, is one of the, some people's childhood dream, because it looks like a lot of fun, get to ride a truck around.
Sure.
I don't know anybody whose childhood dream was to become a biblical scholar, right?
Fair enough,
yeah. So I think it's something that a lot of people come to in adulthood. And in my case, I think my story probably mirrors that of a lot of people, in as much as, for me, it was about, exploration of my own faith tradition, figuring out what I'm going to do in relation to that, wanting to understand some things, and then having someone persuade me that I was good at teaching. And so taking it from my own journey to try to understand, to digging in at PhD level to trying to understand, and then trying to help others understand.
Okay. And in biblical studies, was the New Testament kind of a natural bent for you? Or at some point, did you have to decide OT, NT, and?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, there are ways of trying to get at both at the same time, but they rarely work, unless you're doing something like sort of the Old Testament or Jewish scriptures as they're interpreted in the New Testament. Then you can kind of get at both, but you're still mainly doing New Testament and looking at what they're doing with these texts. Whereas if you're going to teach Old Testament Hebrew Bible, they expect you to be looking at it in its original context, right?
Sure.
Rather than the reception. Yeah, no, there was a while. I think this is often the case, again, for biblical scholars. You do Old Testament and then you do New Testament, right? That's
Yeah.
often the order the courses are in.
Sure.
And there was lots of stuff in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, that I just thought was fascinating.
Okay.
But oftentimes, particularly if you're coming from or through a background in Christianity, then some of the more pressing questions are sometimes, in the New Testament.
Yeah.
Some of the more puzzling things are often in the Old Testament,
Yeah.
right? It's like,
Yeah.
okay, Leviticus, and the sacrificial system, how did that work? And, so those things did grab my interest as well. Okay. And some of it is that, as you mentioned, I have interest in science fiction. I have interest in lots of things, music, and part of it is you just have to pick at some point.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. And kind of be amateur at a few things and expert in one.
Yeah, and I mean, I've some of the things that I just dabbled in have really taken off and become focuses in their own right.
Okay, there you go.
But you can't do that with everything.
Sure. And so how about, and then even more focused as you got into New Testament, how did you end up in languages? Did that come across as exciting right away?
Yeah, so the language component, I think, is always there, whether you're doing, Old Testament or New Testament, Hebrew Bible, or,
just to say, because you're chair of New Testament languages, right?
It's language and literature.
Language and literature. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the language component, I do love languages. I find languages fascinating. After getting my degrees, I went and taught in Romania for a few years. That's where my wife was from.
Okay.
And so taught in Romanian. Had a full-time live-in tutor prior to that, having married a Romanian, so that helped. Okay. But yeah, I like languages, both dead or ancient ones and modern ones. And so in addition to having the opportunity to do research on the New Testament and do some focus on some of the terminology, some of the concepts, cultural background that maybe explains some of the language that's used. Also found my way, which is part of what led me to work on John the Baptist more recently, into working on Mandaean literature, which is in a dialect of Aramaic. And I'd long found Aramaic, particularly Aramaic as it was spoken in New Testament times, fascinating, right? That would have been Jesus' primary spoken language, maybe his only spoken language, depending on one's view of that. And so that's an important part of the picture. And yet we have almost all of his words, right, with just a couple of exceptions, in Greek translation, right? And yet sometimes it seems as though if we dig behind the Greek, maybe there's been some misunderstanding, or there's some nuance that the translator has chosen one of two possibilities. So language is something that continues to fascinate me.
Okay. Well, turning to the book, A to Z of the New Testament, the things that experts know that everyone else should too. The title does a good job of this, but still, I wonder if you could just summarize the main thesis of the book and maybe say something about where the motivation for this came from. Like, did it come from a gap that you were seeing between kind of the pew and your own scholarship, or?
Yeah, so I actually tell the story of the thing that made me long want to write a book like this. But then sort of Erdman's approached me and they had this idea for a book. It was like answering all these questions, all the things that people misunderstand about the New Testament, stuff like that. And I was like, wait a minute, I think you're describing this book that I've long wanted to write. And so we had this moment where the two interfaced and connected. But I was living in the UK, right? So in the United States, I think, with the separation of church and state, most people, unless they go to a religious school growing up, will not do like religious studies, right? Or and we don't have an advanced placement religious studies, whereas you can do what in the UK they call an A-level in religious studies. There they have a state church, right? They don't have the separation. And if you do the Bible in a conservative religious context, which is what most people probably would encounter, it's going to be much more of a devotional approach, a lot less of the scholarship and things like that. And so you can spend your whole life in church and not get some of the things that scholars talk about in any introduction to the New Testament. And this really hit home to me when I was living in the UK and was asked to give a talk for some students who were doing essentially high school level religious studies. And so I asked, well, what kinds of things do they cover? And got some past exams to give me an idea. And they're covering what we call the synoptic problem. Like, how do these gospels relate to one another? Who wrote them? What's the date? Is this really by the person whose name is there at the start of it? And these are things that are the bread and butter of any intro course, but you can spend your whole life not hearing about them, right? And I realize there's this huge disconnect, right? So, because if teenagers in the UK can cope with this, and they certainly seem to, then there are people in pews who can cope with this too, right? And I think some pastors will steer clear of these things because on the one hand, it's not great sermon material, right? I mean, here's how the gospels relate to one another, or here's who wrote this and how we know, right? I mean, that should not be a sermon, right? Fair enough. But for adult education context and things like that, either the courses, the Sunday school classes are taught by people who've never studied this, or people will steer clear of it because they think, well, this will upset people, if we ask these difficult questions, things like that. But it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If people had heard this all their lives and knew that this was part of understanding the Bible and that there are these questions and that this tradition might, the answer based on actual careful study of the biblical text might be different than the longstanding traditional answer from a few hundred years ago, people would not necessarily find that threatening, right? And so it becomes this perpetuating thing, right? And it goes on and on. And so had long thought there must be a way of breaking into that circle, right? And saying, hey, here it is in a form that hopefully won't be threatening, right? That will help you understand it, will get you started, but never got around to actually trying to write the book, right? I mean, I tried to incorporate that in my classes as I teach intro courses for sometimes for students who are not all that interested in the subject matter. So bridging the gap, bridging the gulf between me and them that way. But then Erdman's got in touch with me, had this idea that sounded enough like my idea that had been on the back burner for a long time that we connected the two, and the A to Z of the New Testament is the result.
And was the A to Z part your idea, their idea? Because I just again thought that was a unique approach and easy to follow and kind of captivating.
It started out as the ABCs of New Testament study was my working title. And then I sort of shared some early drafts with some people, including some who'd been to seminary, and they're like, so you do help people get the intro stuff, but there's a lot in here that goes beyond the basics.
Sure. Yeah.
You're taking people pretty far, even if you're trying to start where they are.
Yeah.
And so that's when I said, okay, maybe it's A to Z rather than ABCs. It's not just the intro.
Okay.
And then I thought, I could have 26 chapters and start each one with a different letter. And that involved some relatively late in the process shuffling as I'd already written quite a few chapters and suddenly was like, oh, but then I could, and so I started trying to figure out, could I come up with 26 titles for chapters that would also work with the content that I wanted to? And I think anyone reading the book and looking at some of the chapter titles will realize that some of them were fairly straightforward and very easy, and some less so.
So what, can I ask this, as you were putting together, trying to fit them into the A to Z, just to give people an idea maybe of how much richness there is in the book and how much maybe more there is, how much did you leave on the cutting room floor to kind of make it fit into the A to Z? Like, are there enough important things that you left out of the book that could make another volume, or go back from Z to A, or was this pretty much fit everything into this that you wanted to?
So volume, the sequel, the alpha to omega of New Testament studies or something like that, right? Do the Greek. So I've had people ask me, why didn't you do that? And it's like, it's because it's not that book, right? It's not going to that kind of level.
Okay.
But is trying to help people understand what's involved in studying these texts, and recognizing and taking seriously that they are translations. So I think the short answer is there wasn't, I don't think there was anything that I left out in the sense of, I put it in there and then I said, oh, I just can't include this. I think there were always things in my mind where I thought, oh, I could also do this, and oh, I could also do that. And it just would have it would have distracted. It would have made it, significantly longer.
Okay.
Um, and yeah, just for those who haven't peeked into it yet, it's not like a Bible dictionary, right? Where you have all these A things and then all these B things, and it's like going through letter by letter with a list of things.
Yeah.
The 26 chapters with different letters starting them is really just a bit of a gimmick. There's a lot of stuff in there that's just trying to make tackling some serious academic content fun, right? And yeah, there's somebody who left, I think, one of the few negative reviews on Amazon was like, yeah, just corny jokes and things like that. And I was like, some people are like, I'm there for the corny jokes.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So,
no, I
if
thought
that's
you
not
took
your cup of tea, this book's not for you, right?
Yeah. I thought you really did, as you said, like took a New Testament introduction course and made it fun and accessible, and if there's corniness, I mean, in a traditional class setting, that's what would make the class fun, even. I mean, to some degree, or hold some attention.
Yeah, the things that we remember, right, from sermons, from classes, are often the jokes and the illustration,
Yeah.
even the ones that made us groan, right?
Sure. Yeah.
They lodge in your memory. And so, I do think I say in the like epilogue of the book, some of this, if you were groaning, it's intentional, right? Some of this is actually good pedagogy.
Yeah.
So I try to take, the kinds of things that you'd find in, because there are lots of New Testament introductions out there, right?
Sure.
So the question, an obvious question, why would you need another one?
Yeah. But
if you start looking at them, you have to have a certain level of enthusiasm and self-motivation to go either book by book through these, and you know that you're going to have, Jude, and you're going to have all these other ones that are neglected that maybe aren't fascinating to you right off the bat. And either that, or you're going to work through something that's a bit more thematic, but then, is authorship interesting? Is that a question? Why not just assume that the people wrote and carry on? The synoptic problem, if you see that as a label and don't know what it means, it's not, you're not going to be like, oh yes, that's on my, long been on my list of things to learn. Right? Yeah. And so I tried to meander through the contents, right? To start with a funny story or something puzzling about the text that maybe you always wondered about this. Or here's an expression that we use in English, and how does that relate to the biblical story? Those kinds of things.
Yep. Well, no, I mean, I don't think I have an Amazon review yet, but I should pull one up, and mine will be.
Oh, please do.
Honest that I've done New Testament introductions, and I felt like I learned so much more from this book, and in a real fun, engaging way. Like, it wasn't a slog to get through. Like, I don't know, like not that this was a really good book, but like James Dunn New Testament introduction, where the first half is introducing you to other people's approaches to New Testament introduction, like literature reviews. And this was just, I don't know, meat and engaging stuff and assumptions that we make in the church all the time. I thought it was fantastic. I wonder if you thought about this, like, where's the gap, or why do you think the gap exists between scholarship and the church? Like, as you say, I think in the book that most Sunday school classes would have no interest in tackling a lot of these subjects. Sermons, as you already said, would kind of bore people on these subjects. But there still has to be a place for this information in the church and getting to the person in the pew. Why do you think there is this gap? Do you think it's just people unequipped to teach it?
That's sometimes the case, maybe very often. I will also, take some of the responsibility on behalf of those who are in my field, that sometimes the way we write things is not designed to help you think about, well, how is this relevant, right? And one of the things I think has helped me write a book like this one is the fact that, I teach an adult Sunday school class at my church.
Okay.
And I have several sort of lay and retired ministers who've attended for a long time. And they would constantly ask, if I would go get into some nitty gritty detail, they'd be like, so James, just bring it back. What's the payoff of this? Like, why should we care? How does this apply to our lives? Yeah. And you get asked that often enough, you start to actually realize yourself, oh, I need to ask that question. I need to think about this. There are some of us who are language nerds, history nerds, all the various sorts of nerds who just find certain things interesting, right? And I hope that for instance, I've been doing a study on the Gospel of Mark, and so we got up to the subject of recent and forthcoming books, John the Baptist, the story of his beheading, and so I mentioned that we also have some information about John and his execution from a Jewish historian from the first century named Flavius Josephus. And somebody in the class actually said, hey, for those who may not know, can you say a little bit more about him? And it would have been easy. I'm not sure I sidestepped this. You'd have to ask somebody else in my class for their honest opinion, but it would have been very easy to talk about Josephus and or what he says about John the Baptist in a way that just makes things seem difficult or just seems irrelevant. And so knowing even what to take, how to connect the dots, telling the story, if you know this information that Josephus provides and you read the story in Mark and you have both of them, right? Because a lot of this was common knowledge about Herod Antipas and about John the Baptist and things like that. And when you put the two together, here's how this enriches your understanding and appreciation of the story that Mark tells.
Yeah.
Right? And there was a time when I probably would have found it quite natural to neglect to show what's the payoff of this, right? How does it make this story that you're interested in understanding and applying to your life more interesting? How does it make it come alive? Don't just give us the history. Right? So I try and put some extra effort into that.
Okay. Do you think
not everybody finds fascinating the things that I do?
Right? Yeah. I find that more and more in life. Not everyone's and doesn't necessarily need to find what you find fascinating all the time. Do you think though there are hints in that and in the church of whether recognized or not by people of a bit of an anti-intellectual, I don't know, culture, where we're a bit afraid of going deeper, digging into this further, that might dry out the spiritual vitality that we do have? Or
I'm sure there is some of that, and some of it is a result, I think, of just how deceptively easy it is to read the Bible. You have it in your own language, and the translation will often take all those things that actually are obscure and unclear and make them seem clear.
Yeah.
And if you don't look at your footnotes, right, you're reading the book of Job and it's like, oh, this makes sense. It makes sense. And meanwhile, there's like 2 inches of footnotes at the bottom of the page saying the Hebrew word here is uncertain, right?
Yeah.
In other words, your English translation is making it perfectly clear to you, and the people who are translating it have no idea what certain words that they're translating mean. Right?
Sure.
And so they are making it clearer than the original is to them.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's potentially terrifying, right? Depending on what your view of the Bible is.
Yeah.
It's like, this is the ultimate authority for my faith and life. And even the experts don't know what it means in places. Like, what do I do with that?
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think that when we approach the Bible without recognizing that, there are human authors and there's a process of translation, even if that makes some of it just come alive and seem very simple and direct, connects with you, a lot of it is just going to be puzzling. Right? Yeah. How do I make sense of this psalmist who's wishing, harm to befall their enemies? If this is God speaking to me, right? What does that say? Whereas if you recognize this is a human author in ancient Israel who's giving voice to their own spiritual journey and outlook, you understand it differently. Right? And so bringing in these aspects can be threatening, but often I think it's threatening if we have an oversimplified view of the Bible and of faith. And so there is a wedge that often is inserted between the Bible and the pursuit of understanding. Yeah. But it doesn't have to be. And that's, I think, something that's become very important to me to try to convey. And there's some of that's reflected in A to Z in the New Testament, but I think other things that I write in the future will dig into that even more.
Oh, kind of still connected to that. I wonder if you could comment on this. I met with a guy not too many months ago in my church who wanted to chat about some theological convictions that our church had that he wasn't too on board with. We sat down, we talked in circles for an hour or two, and then It's I have no names, but I don't know he also probably won't listen to this. But if he does, I hope it's helpful. But I think there's others like him. When I approach the idea of like, what if I read a book on your position and you on mine, and we try and let that aid our conversation a little. His reply was, I don't read books. I only read the Bible. And then asking why no books? And I think a legitimate thing, and I think what you're kind of speaking to too. His answer was, well, if I read books about the Bible, there's so many different opinions. How am I supposed to know which scholar's right and which one's wrong? So to some degree, and I understand his position there, was easy to just keep those guys at bay. And as you kind of the simplicity of the Bible, kind of as you say, how would you say you do, lay people, how do you approach the New Testament scholarship world where there can be such differing opinions? How do you, I don't know, filter that in a way that it is enriching and edifying? And
Yeah, right. Let me address this individual who
okay.
may or may not be listening,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's a concern that I'm sure many others have.
Hmm.
So on the one hand, if you read just the Bible in maybe one translation in your own language and don't look at any of the notes or any of those kinds of things, then what you may not realize you're getting is the work of a committee of scholars, because that's who was involved in translating the Bible, who have read those books, right, and who've discussed, which is the best way to understand this word, and then how do we render it into English to get, is there a way we could capture both this nuance of the Greek and that nuance? Because there seems to be a wordplay that the Gospel of John is engaging in here, and in English it's hard to capture that. Well, they might say, well, how about if we put this meaning in the text and we put this thing in the footnote? And of course they'll say, okay, but are they going to look at the footnotes, right? And this hypothetical person that I'm addressing here might not. Right?
Yeah.
But if you're looking at the footnotes, you're already looking at the commentary of those who worked on this translation, right?
Yeah.
Who were wrestling with the things that you're trying to avoid wrestling. And so by not looking at the books, all you're doing is letting the result of that committee deliberation be what you accept, right?
Yeah. Oh, that's
and
a good
so
point.
It's as though you read one book and
Yeah.
then just accepted whatever it said.
Yeah.
Right? And if that's what you need and you're satisfied with that, fine. But be aware that that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
Right? And I think what oftentimes we get at some point in our Christian lives is the sense that a childlike faith, right, of the sort that Jesus talked about, involves just accepting things and not asking too many questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I understood it that way. And then I had a child, and it's like, yeah, kids are asking why like all the time.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Right? And so I think that what childlike faith is about is that there's this trust of the parent, but it's precisely because you trust the parent that you're not afraid to ask why.
Yeah.
And that's part of my mission as a New Testament scholar, as well as a Christian, is to help people transition from faith as I accept everything I was told, and it's this house of cards where if I let any gust of a fresh perspective in here, the whole thing might come collapsing down, to a trust that's focused on trusting God, right? Precisely because even if you just read the Bible will probably convince you, if you read it carefully, that your own human understanding is limited and fallible and might be wrong.
Yeah.
Right? And so trusting God enough that you can ask the hard questions, you can question yourself. You can say, do I like this interpretation because it seems it's the most plausible historically and linguistically, or do I like this interpretation because that's what I want to believe?
Yeah.
Right? And be open to changing our minds, precisely because relationship is about growth. The Christian faith is about trust in God and recognition of our own limitations. And so if it was about getting all the answers right, then that, they're both, I both think that the chances of anybody being saved would be very slim, but
Sure.
also that God probably would have given us a very different Bible. Right?
Yeah.
Had the answers clearer and organized in a way so that you didn't have to puzzle them out.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting is that a lot of the people who think that, and sometimes they're the more anti-intellectual of a certain sort,
Mhm.
but often they're the ones who think that it is a puzzle that you're supposed to figure out. And, saving faith is me having gotten the right answer, unlike those other people who disagree with me.
Yeah.
And so we get some of that in there as well. And
Yeah.
so there are forms of faith that are anti-intellectual, and there are ones that are actually in some ways intellectual, but in a way that feeds rather than challenges our own tendencies towards arrogance and pride and over being overly self-confident.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. That's such a good answer. And that's a good point I've never thought of before. That, I mean, even the guy that says, I'm only going to read the Bible, you're submitting yourself to a committee of decisions. And
Yeah, Bible translators.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, just to give people a bit of a taste of the book, and you don't need to answer these exhaustively as you do in the book, but can I just fire off some questions pointing to a few things that you've written that in the book that I think especially stood out because they're so common in the church, almost comedically to some degree sometimes. Was Jesus born in a barn?
I would say probably not.
Okay.
How much more information do you want?
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah.
These are kind of a short word answer. Was the eye of the needle a gate in the wall surrounding the city? I mean, the amount of times I've heard that preached from the pulpit.
That's one that I think it's safe to say, since it's not found in any ancient source, was made up by wealthy Christians, sort of people who have the kind of computing technology that we're relying on to have this conversation, globally speaking, who really were like, so the rich, it takes a miracle for the rich. Maybe if we have we'll enlarge the opening a little bit, and we'll find a way to get ourselves through there. There's an interesting picture in that, I think, of what we often do with the Bible, right? Is, even if we say we're just interpreting the Bible, we'll come up with some story that supposedly fills in the background, or we'll come up with some way of understanding it that makes the loophole larger, as it were, so that we can fit through. And so that's a good one, I think, to have asked me in this conversation, just because it does illustrate this thing that we sometimes do with the Bible, right?
Sure.
It's not just what the Bible says, it's what the Bible says, but we'll find ways of avoiding the plain meaning if it's too hard.
Yeah. It would be interesting to try and find, probably impossible to ever do, but the origin of that idea. I mean, if there's no historical credibility to it, I mean, who is the first person that began suggesting this might be the gate?
And I think I looked into it and found, at least there was I found someone who was like the first printed mention that I was able to find. I can't remember who it was because it was long enough after these texts were written. It seemed like, it's probably, not. And it was not based on anything to do with archaeology or the contemporary thing. In fact, I think some of it probably goes back to tour guides.
Okay.
And that's one of those things, if you ever visit the Holy Land.
And
I try to weave some stories about visiting places into my books as well. But tour guides will be like, this is the very place, or did you know? And sometimes those things sometimes they're things that have gone from sermons into materials that the tour guides then digest. But sometimes it goes from tour guides making up stuff that they think will entertain visitors into sermons and commentaries and things like that.
Yeah. Well, I think probably prior to maybe undergrad or whatever, the amount of times that I told people that the eye of the needle was a gate around the city are probably too many to count. Just because I heard it and I relayed it and it sounded right. And well, this is maybe more of a comedic one, but I think a good correction. And you do in the book, you explain it in a way that you kind of give the right title to the book, and which is very helpful. But is there a book of Revelations?
And that's another one where somebody on Amazon was like, we didn't need a book to tell us. It's like, but I'm sure you've met, as I have, people who call it the Book of Revelations.
Oh, every day.
And it gave me an actual, we can sometimes scholars will just be grumpy and it's like, don't get this wrong, here's the right title. But actually, why is it called what it is, right? Where does the title come from? And so that, what I tried to do in the book was to take even something that people sometimes get wrong and not say, shame on you.
Yep.
But to say, yeah, here's why, right? Here's
Yeah.
why we hold this view, or here's why it's, because Book of Revelations makes a lot of sense. Book of Revelation, right? It says, it doesn't sound like the book of the Revelation, book of a
Yeah.
Revelation. It sounds weird in English. And so it's,
Yeah.
and part of it is the fact that we put book of in front of everything.
Sure. Yep.
And then people approach the book of Romans, right? Not expecting it to be a letter from Paul to this group. And sometimes just recognizing what kind of literature we're reading helps us, just understand, for instance, that we're listening in on one side of a conversation. And
that's a good point.
That's sometimes challenging.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to give people a few examples of, I mean, like all those things, if you're in the church at all, those are familiar, relatable, fun to find an answer for, and you go so in depth on, especially on the was Jesus born in a barn? I mean, that was almost a whole chapter, if not a whole chapter, I think, and I learned a lot from that, and so many more of these. I wonder, from your position in watching students come through your program, just again, kind of the origins of the book and talking about anti-intellectualism and whatnot, what is your feeling these days about biblical literacy? Do you feel like it's increasing, decreasing? Are you encouraged as you see students go through your programs?
Yeah, so that's a great question. On the whole, I have a sense that students who show up in my classes, where once there was a wide spectrum from people who maybe grew up in a family that just never read the Bible, right? And they were taking this as a core curriculum requirement to, or to just to find out more about this text that's important to others. But then I'd also have some who read the Bible, as part of their daily devotions and have always heard it in church. And so know at least the sort of greatest hits, as it were.
Yeah.
And now it seems like even the ones who have a church context, even the ones who would say the Bible is really important to me, don't know it that well, and are really surprised by some of the contents in a way that I find interesting. That, sad, as sad as that is, it does make my job easier, because one of the challenges teaching was, what do I do when students are bringing such different arrays of prior knowledge?
Yeah.
And what strikes me is the irony that this is true in a time when there are more ways to get answers to questions that reflect, accurate knowledge of the Bible and even biblical scholarship than used to be the case, right? Once upon a time, you would have had to go and, get a degree, or go to the library and check out a book, or buy a book. But, even I remember when that would have required going to a bookstore rather than just getting online.
Yeah.
Now, there are things like, I'm on Reddit because there's an academic biblical subreddit where, people can ask questions and get answers, and they actually have, sort of flair for the scholars, right? And you have to actually at least let the mods know who you are. So, and so you can get answers to questions more easily.
Oh, that is neat. Yeah.
Right? You may not get all of the information that you need from the book, but you can get on Google Books and see a preview sometimes, and sometimes it's got the pages you need.
Yeah.
And so in a time when, there are Bibles online and so many more and more translations that are, or on your phone on an app, and more ways of accessing that content, more ways of getting access to scholarship, biblical literacy seems to have decreased rather than increased. And that's striking and, really rather sad.
Yeah. Yeah, that's ironic. I mean, with all, as you're saying, all the resources available, it's encouraging to me that people like you exist, that there are scholars that are aware of that and are motivated by that and are tuning into Reddit pages for the sake of putting right answers in people's hands. I would think it would be easy as a scholar to just kind of live in a silo and speak to other scholars but I don't know. I'm encouraged that you're out there trying, even with this book, trying to trying to teach people that aren't going to end up in your classroom.
Yeah. Certainly there's a place for the kind of research that, engages in scholarly discussions of things that might, at 2 or 3 steps removed impact some, a future Bible translation or commentary or something, but is really getting into the weeds in a way that, there's some usefulness to that, right? and there's a place for it. I think that often scholars who teach at, like primarily undergraduate institutions where it's mostly people getting their first degree,
Hmm.
people who teach in, courses that at least count towards a core curriculum. And so not everybody is intrinsically motivated or already interested. Not everybody's coming with a lot of background. It connects you with that audience. It makes you aware that they are out there.
Okay.
And if these texts are important to you, right?
Hmm.
If you're not just doing it as a job, it's like, I'm going to do this because it pays the bills,
Sure.
then I think it's easy to find some inspiration in that to
Okay.
want to get online and figure out where you can actually, help,
Yeah.
make, and so I've tried as well to get my students to, uh, shift away from using Wikipedia, right? Understand that it's a source that can change moment to moment, and odds are it's probably going to be just about right
Yeah.
because there are enough people editing it, and so it tends to. But you don't know who's editing it, right? And
Sure.
so to get them
Yeah.
instead to actually go in and edit, and
Yeah.
get and earn points towards their final grade in my course by contributing to it. Because if you take one class at university that covers some of these topics, there's a reasonable chance you know at least as much and maybe more than a fair number of the people who otherwise will be editing that page,
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
may be interested
That's a
but
good
never
point.
took a course on the subject. And so trying to not just get on there and engage myself, but also get
Yeah.
my students to be people who say, let me make a difference. Let
Yeah.
me contribute some things that are there online so that if somebody else is looking, maybe they'll find this thing that I wrote.
Yeah. Well, you're setting a good example. It wasn't too long ago that I was marking a student's paper and it had a citation from Reddit, which I at the time balked at.
Yeah.
But if
It
there are
depends
scholars
where.
on
Yeah.
Reddit, maybe there's some increasing credibility to some of those citations. Well, I feel like the Christmaker, A Life of John the Baptist, your next book that, 2024. The last one was 2023. You were saying 2024. Is it out already?
It's out. Yeah.
Okay,
Came out in
perfect.
July.
I
So
mean, that book is a good example, I think, of what you're saying with kind of one foot in each field in scholarship and in more of the, I don't know, lay person in that. I mean, you wrote this one for the church, essentially. I'm just the popular
yeah,
kind of crowd.
it's definitely aimed at a general audience.
And then a
I
second version, as you were saying, coming out to the scholarship community.
Yeah.
Okay.
And not just a different version, but a very different book with some
Okay.
very detailed studies of some specific questions.
Okay.
And so with this project, so in the past, some of my past books, like What Jesus Learned from Women, I think was the last one where I was trying to write for everyone. I
Okay.
was like, I want scholars to find this persuasive, and so I'm going to include all this detail, but I
Okay.
want everybody to potentially read this, and so I'll do it this way. And probably didn't give anyone exactly what they were looking for
Okay.
in that book, except probably I mean, there definitely are a handful of people who are well-informed lay people who would appreciate the detail as well as the accessible
Sure.
approach.
Yeah.
But this was the first time where I said, let me try and separate these two,
Okay.
right? And do the academic thing in all of its detail for whoever wants that, my peers in the academy.
Yeah.
But also let me present this to a general audience. And doing that also gave me a chance to do one other thing that I think is important, which is to really dig into the details in the academic monograph that's coming out in
Yeah.
October, but also to ask, to make, as I was doing that, how do these pieces fit together?
Okay.
Because one of the risks as a scholar is if you spend a lot of time, or let's say do a detailed research project digging into one narrow question, then you might find what seems like a satisfactory answer to that question. But if that doesn't fit, if you can't position that information in relation to everything else,
Yeah.
then either will seem like, yeah, this seems plausible on its own, but it doesn't fit anything else we know, so no.
Okay.
Or you have to do, it will take some future work and maybe eventually it will catch on. So I wanted to ask, what's John's life look like? As
Yeah.
well as what can we know about, his family background? What can we know about, his relationship to Jesus? Are these sources that are neglected by scholars worth paying attention to again, and things like that?
Well, why? I mean, another fascinating book and excellent read, and I learned so much. I didn't know there was so much to learn about John the Baptist, which I think was your point. in the book, but why, how do I say, why have
Why
others
none?
considered a biography to John to be an impossible task? And what approach did you take, or what did you find that made that you're arguing at least that makes that possible?
Yeah, thank you. That's a fantastic question, and really gives me a chance to speak to the heart of this project,
Yeah.
right? And sort of both pieces of it, but as reflected in Christmaker. The reason why scholars have sometimes said, in fact, more often than not, said that you just can't write a biography of John the Baptist is that we have a small little snippet in the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. We have those New Testament stories that say he had a baptism for the forgiveness of sins and repentance, and Jesus was baptized, and then he sends a message to Jesus. Jesus says a few things about him. He's beheaded, and yeah, that's a pretty short biography, right? Nobody's going to want to read this, right? It's like you could make a pamphlet, or you could fill in the gaps with lots and lots of speculation, right? And people have done that, right? There have been sort of novelistic
Yeah.
approaches, but I wanted to write, an actual, historical biography, um, creatively connecting dots in the ways that historians and biographers do, but not just, saying, okay, well, wherever we don't have information, I'm going to fill it in with some, creative speculation.
Yeah.
And particularly when you know that what historians until recently had been tending to do, then the sense that this was an impossible task becomes, I think, even clearer, because what historians will do is they'll take those few pieces of information we have and they'll sift them, and often they'll say, yeah, well, this one we're not entirely sure, and this one, we only have it from one source. And so by the time a historian is turning their attention to John the Baptist, they may actually have fewer pieces of the puzzle
Yeah.
than just those ones I listed. They're still there, but they might be like, well, we can't really be sure that that's actually what happened.
Yeah.
And we're not really sure John said that. And that might be a Christian way of depicting him. And so one thing that I did differently, right? I did have some additional source material that I was drawing on, and I'm happy to say more about that as well. But one thing I did differently that's really becoming increasingly the approach adopted to historical questions by scholars was to not take that atomistic approach of like taking each nugget on its own,
Yeah.
sifting it, seeing what falls through the cracks, and then trying to assemble what's left. But to trace the ripples of the splash John made back to their source, so that even if we have something that, if you're skeptical, you might say, well, do we really know he said that? Well, maybe not. But somebody within 50 years of his life is writing this, and so it reflects something of the impact. Maybe it's people trying to spin his life in a new way, but if so, then we should be able to take that and some other pieces from the same time period and kind of triangulate back, right? Trace the ripples back to their point of impact. And if sometimes astronomers will be able to tell you, yeah, there's a star there. We can't see it, right? It's a dense neutron star, but we can see its impact, right? The gravitational pull it's having on things around it. And so I think in the same way, by looking at the movements influenced by John's impact, both positively and negatively, how people are trying to harness John's reputation in relation to their own aims and desires, all of that stuff that once upon a time historians might have said, well, it's spin, it's polemic, it's this, that, which it's not. It's not historical information. Historians are realizing that kind of stuff actually is really useful. Sometimes that's all we have, but it actually does give us insight into historical figures if we use it in the right way.
I'd love to know a bit, as you mentioned, about your source material. What were the other sources that you sourced that maybe haven't received much attention?
Yeah. So there are two main types of sources that I'm referring to here. There's a lot of John the Baptist material that hasn't been studied as much as it deserves. But the two main things, one is there's a group known as the Mandaeans, who are an ancient Gnostic religion that survived down to the present day, but they consider themselves followers of John the Baptist.
Okay.
And they view Jesus as somebody who was a disciple of John's who went off the rails and kind of departed from his teaching. And I'm not saying they're right about that, but what I'm saying is that this group might actually have a historical connection with followers of John who did not become Christians, right?
Yep.
We get the sense already in the New Testament that there were followers of John who were not sure that Jesus was the one about whom John was talking,
Yep.
right? They had their doubts about him. They were thinking, Jesus was crucified. John's coming one must be someone else still to come. And so their sources, right? I'm not saying, again, that they're more historically useful than New Testament sources. Mm-hmm. They are definitely later, and in that sense are further removed. But if you're triangulating, right, then having another perspective, right, another line along which traditions about John the Baptist flowed to trace back can be helpful. And so there was a long time when scholars were very interested in these sources, and then the position shift and the pendulum swung the other way and they were ignored. And so I'm making the case for bringing them back into the picture as having relevant material and information when they're used cautiously and critically.
Okay.
The other main source is Jesus.
Okay.
As Christian readers of the New Testament, we tend to rush past John on our way to Jesus.
Yeah.
And the impression we get is that that's what John wants us to do, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And even if that's our interest, I think that paying due attention to John is important to getting both John and Jesus right in the New Testament, because there's clearly a close connection between the two. Jesus is baptized by John, and so in doing so, associates himself with John's message and his movement. And to the extent that Jesus talks about himself and John as linked in a way that Jesus doesn't talk about anyone else, right? John, even when there's some kind of difference of eating habits or things like that, right?
Yeah.
John came neither eating nor drinking. The Son of Man came eating and drinking. The point is not these are two radically opposed groups. It's like John did this thing, I did this thing. You're not happy either way. Clearly, the problem is you and not us, right? Because you won't listen to us no matter how we approach it. But Jesus connects himself with John over and over again. They say, by what authority do you do these things, right? When he does this action in the temple, it's like, well, I'll ask you one question. John's baptism, right? Was that from heaven or from people, right? So he's constantly linking his own activity with John. And so given that, I think that we can actually look at what Jesus taught and emphasized, and unless we have reason to think that there was a difference between him and John on that point, use what we know about Jesus to fill in our portrait about John, that John was probably teaching the same thing. I mean, after all, the Gospel of Matthew explicitly says that before Jesus came into Galilee proclaiming, repent for the kingdom of God is at hand, John was proclaiming a message that could be summed up in the exact same way. And so I think that we can use Jesus to fill in our portrait of John. And in doing so, if what you're really interested in is Jesus, when you cycle back again, you'll find that your portrait of Jesus is enriched by doing so as well.
Yeah, I think that was my biggest takeaway from the book, and has always been my biggest question about John is, what impact does John the Baptist have on my understanding of Jesus? Because clearly there must be something, even the way Jesus viewed John in terms of saying, the greatest man that has lived up to this point, and obviously made much of him, thought much of him. But the same language always goes through my head that like John's kind of I pass over him. I fly over him, because as you say again, that's what he seems to be doing. He's being like, hey, less of me, more Jesus. So don't spend too much time here.
Yep. And between that, and the fact that it's sort of a blip, it's there in several places. What I realized as a result of digging into this and digging into the question of how much continuity there in fact was between John and Jesus is to realize that probably in a way that the earliest readers of the Gospels would have been aware of, because they were living in that time and place and were aware of things that we have to sort of uncover through historical research. But I think that there's a lot more continuity. There's a lot more that is at least indirectly, connected with John the Baptist when we study the Gospels with questions about John in mind. Now, the questions we ask determine what we find a lot of the time. And sometimes that can be a bad thing, right? It
Yeah.
leads us to miss things. But when we don't ask certain kinds of questions, then we miss things, right? And I found that working on What Jesus Learned from Women, right? Start paying attention to these female characters and suddenly, wow, there's all this stuff here that I just had missed, right?
Yeah.
And I think the same happens with John the Baptist as well.
Yeah. Just asking the right questions,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah. Or
Well,
even paying attention to a particular character, right? Just even paying attention to the individual, whatever questions you ask. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I have to go back and read your I've heard you mention it a few times, and I hadn't seen it yet on your book list. Jesus, what was the title? Jesus and Women, what Jesus learned from
What
women?
Jesus Learned from Women.
Okay.
So, intentionally provocative title,
Okay.
but let me know what you think of it if you get around to reading it.
Yeah, I absolutely will. Though it'll probably come after the first couple that I have to read from you. What was it again? I have it.
Theology and Science Fiction, I think, is probably.
Yeah, Theology and Science Fiction and Religion and Doctor Who.
Yeah.
Those
so
are,
the Doctor Who one is an edited volume, so I have there's less for me in that, which doesn't mean you shouldn't read it. Especially if I gather you're a fan, and so
and there's been I can't, no names are coming to mind right now, but there's been a few scholars in recent years that have done this pairing, all of a sudden a New Testament idea or a biblical studies idea with some Marvel character or something, and making analogies and connections, and I find that fascinating to be able to. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's why, and I'm sure you do too, like Lord of the Rings and all of these things fascinating, because what you can learn from Scripture through those pictures, and
if so, I'm enough of a Doctor Who nerd that I contributed the volume on the episode "The Battle of Ranskor Kolos" to a series known as the Black Archive. So there's a UK publisher based in Edinburgh that's doing one small volume, like a critical study of every single episode of Doctor Who, going back to the classic series. So if you're a fan, then that series is one that I think you enjoy, because often
I'll definitely check it out.
Yeah, and some of the episodes that engage with religion, Curse of Fenric, Heaven Sent and Hellbent, those are their volumes on those episodes that engage with those aspects of the story.
Well, last question on Christmaker, and then I'll let you go. What do you think the most common misunderstandings of John are that you wanted to correct, or even just one? I mean, what is the thing that we assume so much about John that you kind of reveal in the book as being incorrect or misinformed?
Well, the one that I often will go to first is sort of John the caveman, where he's like, he's scraggly, he's unwashed, in a way that we get. I mean, most people were not as washed, but John is dipping in water, right? So he's going to be better washed than he's there doing this thing in the river, and so he should be more washed than anybody else, right? He's facilitating other people doing this. But as a guy who comes across as somewhat unhinged and someone you want to steer clear of, and the thing I'd point to in relation to that is that we're told that tax collectors and prostitutes, soldiers, these people that would have been categorized as sinners, were actually responsive to what John was saying. And if John was either a guy who looks deranged and acts a bit deranged, or was a stereotypical fundamentalist preacher, neither of those types of individuals really, it's going to have the prostitutes and tax collectors are going to be saying, "Hey, this guy, we get him. He's speaking. He's making sense to us. We get it." If you combine, it's like, so you have the fire and brimstone fundamentalist who's also unwashed and dressed like a caveman, and you've lost those audiences entirely, right? And so I think that tells us that we've got John wrong, right? He's doing essentially what I think I like to call John, Prophet Elijah cosplay. Right. He's saying, you've got a prophet like one of old, and God is going to be doing something powerful like God did in the past in our time. But just as often happened, it's not God's going to show up and save us no matter what. God's going to hold us accountable because we're still not doing what we've been called to as the people of God. And I think that John's message, I won't go into the details, but was couched in such a way. And I think he had the kind of charisma, right? The kind of personality, the sense of humor, maybe even, the way with words that he was able to get these points across in a way that people could relate to and could connect with. And he made a huge impact, right? He had followers, far afield from the places that he's mentioned as having actually gone himself. And so I think the main thing is that John was, just a very different sort of figure. And I even used the word charming at one point, I think.
Okay. Yeah, he sounds like, and I got that when I was reading your book, like he's much more of a George Whitefield type than we ever put him at. Like he actually had some charisma and charm and an attractive piece, and not just dressed like a homeless man coming out of the field as a hermit, and suddenly everyone's flocking to him. Well, Dr. McGrath, I don't want to keep you longer. I know you have lots to do and probably more books to be working on too. I'm thankful that you wrote both of these, Christmaker and A to Z. That you can get both of them already, obviously at wherever books are sold. And just thank you for your time. Thanks for making this conversation happen. I appreciate it.
Oh no, Ryley, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you for your interest, for your enthusiasm, and for all you do in sort of mediating what scholars do, weeding out the stuff that's not all that interesting to a general audience, and taking the stuff that is actually has some useful applicability, and helping people get that. So I appreciate what you do as well. Thank you so much.